And this is a paper that was recently discovered. I think it was published a few weeks ago. And it finally puts together some of the puzzle that was missing, in my mind at least. And the term hepatic steatosis means increased fat content of the liver, insulin resistance, but not steatohepatitis. That's when you've got actual damage. So this is fatty liver that is in fact now the cells have become inflamed and that there is now developing towards a chronic irreversible liver disease. So that promotes atherogenic dyslipidemia in patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So this links for the first time fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, and atherogenic dyslipidemia. The reason why this study has only recently been reported is that they studied 200 people and they took liver biopsies. And it's pretty invasive and pretty taxing research, which no one had previously had the courage to do. But as often happens, once you start looking for things that you perhaps hadn't thought might be there, you find unusual findings. So the findings of the study were the following on the next page. So patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease had severe insulin resistance. So that's the first point, that they had that to develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, you need severe insulin resistance in the adipose tissue when compared to patients without non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Despite small differences in triglycerides and HDL cholesterol, patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease had a significantly higher plasma apolipoprotein beta-A1 ratio, and I'll explain that, and smaller LDL particle size. And now that's critical because it's the small LDL particles which are the atherogenic component. The more particles you have in the bloodstream, the more of this protein, apolipoprotein B. And so therefore this ratio would indicate that this person has more particles and more of them are in the small particles, and we call that pattern B, and that is the toxic atherogenic pattern. Of note, these differences between patients with and without NAFLD were independent of the presence of obesity. So being obese, which remember we've linked to risk for all these diseases, wasn't the problem. It was the presence or absence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So worse atherogenic dyslipidemia, and this is what we try to treat in patients with heart disease, was best predicted by the degree of liver fat accumulation, adipose tissue, and systemic insulin resistance. So now we link atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is damaging our arteries, we link that to accumulation of fat in the liver, which is a carbohydrate-driven condition, and systemic insulin resistance. And now we can link the insulin resistance to the heart disease directly through actions in the liver, and the liver becoming impaired in its function because it's become fat and it has stored fat as a result of a high carbohydrate diet in people with insulin resistance. And they said, taken together, worsening insulin resistance and atherogenic dyslipidemia may be key mechanisms explaining the increased cardiovascular risk observed in their patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's well accepted that that's another predictor of heart attack risk is NAFLD, but now they begin to explain why it is and why some obese patients are more likely to have atherogenic dyslipidemia because they have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In summary, we have demonstrated that liver fat accumulation in the setting of insulin resistance and not the degree of overall obesity is the, and I emphasize, main factor associated with worsening atherogenic dyslipidemia. And I emphasize again that it's the carbohydrates in the diet that cause that fatty liver disease. It's not the fat. And therefore this evidence now takes us way beyond the diet heart hypothesis. And now we need a diet liver heart disease hypothesis. It inserts the liver as a crucial component of this disease. And they conclude this paper saying that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was associated with a worse atherogenic lipoprotein profile regardless of similar body mass index and other clinical parameters. So in other words, if you assess these patients without measuring the liver fat, you'd say they're all at equal risk. Where this study advances our knowledge is by saying no, but if you look at the liver and determine how much fat is present in the liver, then you can stratify the patients to those that are increased risk. So we speculate that the lipoprotein profile, and remember we talked about lipoproteins, not cholesterol, the lipoprotein profile is driven mostly by liver fat content and insulin resistance, and appears not to be worsened by obesity or the severity of liver disease. So it is the accumulation of fat in the liver that causes the abnormal metabolic response that develops the atherogenic dyslipidemia, which causes the arterial disease of insulin resistance. And they finish up by saying LDL cholesterol appears unreliable to fully guide therapy in patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Which is really interesting because, again, it's the same problem that these people aren't prepared to kind of let go of their old ideas. It doesn't appear, it is unreliable. We've found that we've got the solution. Let's discount the LDL cholesterol and move on. We don't have to stick with the lipid hypothesis as originally described. Let's move on. So, atherogenic dyslipidemia comprising hypertriglyceridemia, elevated ApoB levels, and low HDL cholesterol levels is driven by excessive triglyceride exchange between these two lipoprotein particles, the VLD and the LDL particles, and that's not important. The point is they've got a mechanism to explain what's happening in the liver and why that's causing these abnormalities that cause atherogenesis. So that abnormality produces increased numbers of atherogenic small dense LDL particles, and that's the first time you've seen the scientists say, confirming that it's the small LDL particles which are atherogenic. There it's described. This is the key. It's carbohydrates and insulin, not ingested fat, drive these effects. And that is crucial. So now, what I've given you the diet-heart hypothesis, and I've given you this new hypothesis, which is breaking news. It's right out there. I couldn't, a month ago, have given you the final part of the jigsaw. I was not, because we didn't have the data. But that's science. Science moves on. Now I was able to explain to you in a complete way how insulin resistance, high carbohydrate diets cause atherogenic dyslipidemia, which cause arterial disease, which is the major disease in type 2 diabetes. And let me remind you how prevalent insulin resistance is in this country. I will show data from Belleville where they were not looking for insulin resistance, but where they started to looking at some of these markers and they looked at fatty liver. And the incidence in the worst group of healthy people walking the streets in Belleville was 65%. So although it may sound that I'm talking about type 2 diabetes, the condition I have, I'm not. I'm talking about insulin resistance, which is so prevalent in this country, and particularly in the Western Cape, but not exclusive to the Western Cape. So what I'm saying today has relevance to the vast majority of South Africans. It's not just those who've already been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And that is why this information is so important. And we have the choice in medicine. We can continue to teach a failed model, a model that has caused the diabetes and obesity epidemic, that is causing millions of South Africans every year or every few years to develop type 2 diabetes. We can go down that route. We can continue to train more doctors and build more hospitals and tell people they must eat lots of carbohydrates. Or we can say, actually, like Winston Churchill said, maybe it's time to look at the results and the outcomes and say maybe we got it wrong. And maybe we should be saying, actually, there's a second model. That is not unconventional. That has a basis in evidence that has been accumulated by Dr. Raven since the 1960s. It is only unconventional because people won't see what is in the literature. That makes it unconventional. And that's what we have to ask the question. We have to teach our medical students that there are two models of chronic disease. There is this model which we taught. There is this model which we now need to teach. And if we don't teach our medical students, they will get it on Twitter. And we have the choice that the students will know more about the disease than their lecturers. And that's a real problem for the future of medicine in this country. So that's the choice we make. And I'm privileged to be able to give this information to you, Madam Chair. It's a huge privilege for me to be able to talk, because this information is not being given anywhere in the world. This is a unique event in the history of modern medicine, that a scientist has been charged with giving unconventional advice and can get up there and say, actually, what I'm telling you is a different interpretation. It is not unconventional. It has been in the literature. It is made unconventional by people who are not prepared to see what's in the literature. And it is people who have invested their lives in believing something, and they're not prepared to see what is different. And it's much easier to shoot the messenger. And that is what has happened. I've been shot. And the only people besides myself and my wife who are suffering are the people of South Africa, because they're not getting the truth. And they deserve the truth. And we deserve to be the first country in the world to say, so far and no further. We have lived a lie for 50 years. It is time for this nation to stand up and say, we are tired of being dominated by other interests. It's time for us to take charge of our nation's health and not to be dictated by forces that have no interest in our nation's health. And that's the challenge we face. And I'm proud to be able to give this message. And I just hope that it'll get out there and the people will hear it and they'll ask, why was Noakes victimized for telling the truth? To summarize, the future understanding of how atherogenic dyslipidemia arises will come from the work of liver experts, hepatologists, who understand insulin-resistant and high-carbohydrate diets, not from cardiologists. And who writes the dietary guidelines are the cardiologists in collaboration with the dietitians. We need the hepatologists to be involved. To protect your heart and arteries, it's best to consult your hepatologist. There's a lot of argument that this high-fat diet, there's no evidence for it, etc., etc., etc. And I indicated to you that I changed my position when I read a book by Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney. And these are two of the great scientists and the people I really look up to in world science in the low carbohydrate diet. Dr. Finney started in the field in 1984, and why did he? Because he read a book of people living in the Arctic who were exercising, I should say Europeans who moved to the Arctic. And they described how when they first arrived in the Arctic and they started eating a high-fat diet, they really couldn't exercise. Within about a week, they suddenly started to feel fine, and their exercise capacity returned to normal. And so he wondered what would happen if you took people and put them on a high-fat diet. Would they adapt to it? And he did the study in 1984, which showed that people exposed to a high-fat diet would be able to maintain or slightly improve their performance over a period of 6 weeks. So he did that study, and he became convinced that there was value in the low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. And for the past 30 years, he sat on the sidelines. No one listened to him. He never gets invited to speak at conferences, and so on. And he introduced Jeff Volek to this work. And Volek, I was asked to review his position, and I said this guy's done research that is also Nobel Prize winning stuff, because like Raven, he's provided the information of how valuable this low carbohydrate diet is. And I could have chosen many studies that they have done. And this is the best study in my view. It is a randomized controlled trial in patients with the metabolic syndrome, and he puts half of them onto high carbohydrate, or maintain the more carbohydrate in the diet, and the other group into the low carbohydrate diet. So he's putting people with a metabolic syndrome on a high-fat diet, which according to conventional advice will kill the patients, because you can't put a patient with metabolic syndrome onto a high-fat diet because the high-fat diet's killing them. And that's the beauty of this study, is he's looking for a definitive answer. It's going to be either one way or the other. And this please understand, people say, but you only had 20 people in the subject, the trial, or both sides. These are expensive trials, and there's no money to do it. He does not get funding from the National Institute of Health because, for reasons we've described, he has to go and raise this money himself. And that's why we formed the Noakes Foundation, to help people who want to study this where they can't get the funding elsewhere. So, let's look at the results. So here's the paper published in 2008, and in red we're going to see the group who were randomized to the high carbohydrate, low fat diet, and in yellow we're going to see the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And notice this is a 60% fat, and they call it a ketogenic diet. And the answer is that it does produce ketones, but it's not a ketoacidotic genetic diet. Yeah. The key difference, this is still, although the patients are ketotic, they're not ketoacidotic. They will have ketone bodies in the range that I showed you yesterday, up to 1 perhaps. So let's look. So now they studied for, as I recall, 6 months. This is their body mass change, and the low carbohydrate, high fat diet outperforms the high carbohydrate, low fat diet. But that's really not what we're interested in. Here, abdominal fat, again, the low carbohydrate diet outperforms. This is now getting more interesting. This is the fasting glucose in the morning, and the glucose is lower. These are people with insulin resistance. Their glucose levels are lower. That must indicate that their insulin resistance has improved slightly. And there we see it. There's a 50% reduction in their insulin concentrations compared to about 18% change on the high carbohydrate, low fat diet. So it is true that people on metabolic syndrome do benefit when they eat a calorie restricted high carbohydrate diet. That's not in question. But metabolically, it's not the same as putting them on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, because there are unique attributes of the low carbohydrate, high fat diet, metabolic effects, which you cannot reproduce in a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, and that is critical to understand. So a lot of the meta-analyses that I'm sure we're going to hear about, or we've heard about, they look at the final outcome in weight and so on and so forth. But that's not the key. The key is what happens to this range of abnormalities that promote atherogenesis. And losing weight by itself will not solve that problem if you're still eating a high carbohydrate diet. You have to eat the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. So insulin goes down. That's a measure of insulin resistance. And what that tells us is that the level of insulin resistance improved by almost 60% in these people with metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, when they were put on a high fat diet. So we frequently read, but diabetics is because they ate a high fat diet in the history and that's why they developed diabetes. It's not possible. The biology is clear. A high fat diet reduces insulin resistance. It does not increase it. So diabetes cannot be caused by a high fat diet. And then leptin. And remember that leptin is important in regulating satiety. And leptin goes down despite the fact that they lose more weight. And that tells you that they're becoming more leptin sensitive. They lose the weight, they're responding to the leptin because that takes away your hunger. And so they become leptin sensitive again. And that means again that they're going to be better off. Triglycerides are, as you know, one of the key markers of metabolic syndrome, and there they are going down 50% on the high-fat diet compared to 20% on the other diet. And this is the area under the curve. Again, it's just the same measure. The results are almost the same. So the triglycerides have come down. Now here's the HDL-C, which we all told is the good cholesterol. What we're not told is when you eat a high carbohydrate diet, your good cholesterol comes down. No one tells you that because it's inconvenient. And you go on a high-fat diet, HDL cholesterol goes up. That has to be good because this is good cholesterol. And here you go. What happens on a high-fat diet? The good cholesterol goes down. So when you're told that you put on a high carbohydrate diet and your total cholesterol goes down, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good because you could have reduced your good cholesterol, HDL cholesterol. So that again shows us how we simplified the model. Here's the ratio of triglycerides to HDL, and that again is a very strong predictor of your level of insulin resistance and risk of heart attack, and it's gone down dramatically on a high-fat diet. And here we come to the small LDL particles, which are the atherogenic ones, which get into the arteries and kill us. And what happens on the high-fat diet? As shown by Dr. Krauss in 1998 and ignored, completely ignored, the high carbohydrate diet increases the small LDL-C particles. That very particles that are damaging our arteries are increased on a high carbohydrate diet, and they're reduced on a high fat diet. Once again, we knew this in 1998, and we didn't put it into practice. Now, this is even more remarkable. This is the saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream, which are also indirectly linked to heart disease. In other words, the more saturated fat you have in the blood, the greater your risk of heart attack. Now you eat more saturated fat, and the saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream go down. Why is that? Because these are driven by carbohydrates, not by fats. And Dr. Volek, in his most recent paper, put patients on increasing amounts of carbohydrate and showed that this is a linear relationship. The more carbohydrate in the diet, the more saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream. And that is atherogenic as well. So here we have people eating more saturated fat, and the saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream go down. So that eating more fat made it less atherogenic. And ApoB is simply a measure of the number of small LDL particles, and so you can see they've gone down, and that would be predicted from that small LDL particles. And this is a ratio of the small LDL particles to the HDL particles, and again it's improved. So you're getting fewer of the small LDL particles and more of the HDL particles, and it's looking good. So this paper was published in 2008. I've repeatedly been told that there's no evidence to support the low carbohydrate diet. There's no published evidence. There are no randomized controlled trials. When I read the book written by Drs. Volek, Finney, and Westman in 2010, I read these papers and I said, the truth has been hidden from us. My education did not include this. Why not? And there is the evidence. So when I say that the low carbohydrate diet has a greater effect on all coronary risk factors than does a high carbohydrate diet, this is the evidence. And it cannot be disputed. One could argue that this is one study, but the biological changes, when you talk biology, which is what's important, the biology is clear, and I've explained it to you. You have to be able to explain that, because the biology, this is exactly what you would expect from the biology. And ultimately, we have to believe the biology.